I received orders to go to Vietnam as an advisor to the Vietnamese Airborne Brigade around the same time Patty gave birth to our son, David Joel. Patty wanted to stay in the Campbell area while I was away. My raider buddy, Jack Speed, owned a home in the country just outside Memphis. When he mentioned that the house next door was for sale, we bought it immediately. I had to stay at Campbell to work throughout the week, but thanks to Fred Terry, who completed his required cross-country training by shuttling me back and forth to Memphis every weekend in his chopper, I was able to get the new house squared away and ready for family occupancy. The 1st Brigade, meanwhile, was about to embark on a big exercise at Naz Trace State Park in western Tennessee. Its genesis occurred in long talks that Hank Lund, my brilliant S3 operations officer, and I had about counterinsurgency and the probable inability of the 101st to fight a war of that nature, given that the division's entire frame of reference was conventional war. Drawing on Lund's considerable 4 years of Special Forces experience and the latest Vietnam-tested SF doctrine for insurgency operations, the objective of the Naz Trace exercise was to teach the troopers to respond offensively to the insurgent using the traditional principles of war as our guide, but the methods of the guerrilla. Lund was the project officer for the exercise, which involved Vietnam-experienced Special Forces personnel from Fort Bragg as part of the guerrilla aggressor forces. It required our men not only to beat the enemy, but also to win the support of the locals in 4 mock villages. It was a damn good field problem that would have given the soldiers a fair idea of what was soon in store for them. Unfortunately, before the exercise had barely begun, it was cancelled when the ongoing problems in the Dominican Republic since the assassination of dictator Trujillo 4 years before exploded, and American interests there were no longer assured. LBJ called in the Marines. Meanwhile, the 82nd, whose orientation was Latin America, was alerted with the 101st designated as the follow-up unit. Fortunately, the 82nd and the Marines provided enough of a show of force to bring the tiny island country under control, and the 101st's Dominican Republic alert was over as quickly as it had come on. But then, without even a day to catch our breath, the word we'd long expected finally came down. The 101st was being alerted for deployment to Vietnam. Colonel Timothy's 1st Brigade had been chosen as the spearhead. Ready or not, I thought, here we come. The arrival of the Screaming Eagles 1st Brigade in July 1965 brought the total number of American personnel in Vietnam to 79,000. Though the first few weeks after the troops' longboat journey were scheduled for everyone to regain their land legs, adjust to the heat, and square away gear, within 3 days of the brigade's welcome at Cam Ranh Bay by General Westmoreland and Ambassador Maxwell D. Taylor, our units were conducting squad and platoon-sized local patrols throughout our area of operation. We were aided by Vietnamese guides assigned 1 per platoon. They only knew a dozen English words, but they were invaluable as instant teachers in Vietnamese customs and greatly facilitated our dealings with the locals. At night, on position along the perimeter, skittish green troopers saw a VC behind every bush. Exploding grenades, tracers, and the bang thump of M79 AS kept everyone awake and on edge, as many of the soldiers created a mini-war among themselves. What I had felt was insufficient stateside training had been compounded by army-wide safety regulations that prevented our soldiers from learning about living in an armed environment. It didn't help that the army at this time was predominantly made up of city boys who not only had not grown up with a rifle in their hands, but also had no idea about coping with the bush either. After a few nights of Custer's last stand, Colonel Timothy issued an order that no weapon would be loaded. This stopped a lot of the panic, but shadows and jungle noises were still fought with great enthusiasm. 2 medics in our support battalion, for example, became the brigade's first Purple Hearts when their unit took on another of ours in a wildfire fight in an early case of friendly fire casualties. One of our troopers on patrol tripped while carrying an M79, which was loaded against orders with the safety off. His fingers hit the trigger, and bang thump, he wounded a dozen troopers. On another patrol, a couple of 100 yards away, as Ridgway said at Bastogne of the newly committed 17th Airborne Division, I can never get over the stupidity of our green troops. The 2 short months since the 1st Brigade was alerted for deployment to Vietnam had been non-stop for everyone. Word of the move had spread through Fort Campbell like wildfire. I, for one, had been given the top-secret news at 1,000 hours, and when I went home for lunch at noon with no intention of telling my wife, the first thing Patty said was, "So, the 1st Brigade's going to Vietnam." It turned out Brigade XO Rogers had told his wife, and she passed it on to Patty in a flash. So much for security. My advisory orders had been cancelled, and Colonel Timothy and I headed to Vietnam immediately for a short recon to see what we were in for. When we returned, while the troops began concentrated training on fighting in a jungle environment, we assembled all the guys in the brigade who had previous duty in Vietnam to get their input for the move. Logistics was a particularly serious concern, so Herb Dexter, a 7th Division Korea Battlefield Commission with 3 Special Forces tours to Vietnam under his belt, was an absolutely invaluable source of information. So was Joe Hicks, already a 2-war veteran with the Marines in World War II and the 24th Division in Korea, who had 2 SF tours in Vietnam as well. Hicks was a damn good man who, on top of everything else, had survived 69 days cut off. We had centralized the planning, operational logistics and personnel to the S3 shop, where I was the coordinator. We received maximum support from DA, including a direct hotline that allowed us to bypass the multiple layers of headquarters in between. Amazingly, the only serious issue we had during the planning stage was DA's insistence that we deploy with winter gear and dress blues, a ludicrous requirement for Vietnam's tropical climate. They also insisted we take all our Organic Table of Organization and Equipment, TOE, even after we pointed out that many items, such as recoilless rifles and mules, were of little value on a counter-guerrilla battlefield. The feeling I got was that DA didn't think we'd be there too long and wanted us to retain our tactical integrity in every way. Through our hotline, I tried my best to at least remove the winter and dress gear requirement, but it wasn't until Colonel Timothy took the matter to our CG, Major General Beverly Powell, that DA modified its position. Winter gear became officially out, but we did have to take our dress greens and summer uniforms, though none of us could figure out when we'd possibly be expected to wear them. Lund got the mission of handling the operation. He and Grady Jones, who had only returned from a Vietnam advisory stint 10 months before, volunteered to go back with the brigade. Lund produced an absolute masterpiece, which, in part, utilized commercial air and rail transport to get the brigade to the west coast of the United States and onto its slowboat to Southeast Asia. The plan, a document a foot thick, required few adjustments and later served as a model for such operations at the infantry school. When it was finished and its planners recovered from their celebratory binge, the final coordination of the move was left to Assistant S3 Captain Terry. Lund and Jones had gone back to Vietnam with me as part of the brigade's advanced party. The party was composed of a stud lieutenant from each infantry battalion and attached unit, as well as a small brigade staff and a few other key people. Our mission, to prepare for the rest of the unit's arrival, proved nearly impossible for a long time. The MACV staff orchestrating our deployment, in Grady Jones's words, was like, "The young boy who got his first girl in the bushes. Now I got it, don't know what to do with it." We initially left Lund as AR liaison in Saigon at General Westmoreland's request. It proved a particularly frustrating job for him, as the brigade's destination was being changed almost every day. Lund was caught between keeping up with the confused MACV planners and keeping me at bay. I had lots of questions, and through no fault of his own, he couldn't get the answers. MACV was violently shifting from a slow-paced advisory concern to a full-blown war headquarters. Our problems were just part of the overall rough transition. The command was not structured to become an instant field army. How much easier it would have been had DA sent over such a HQ and kept MACV free for its advisory duty and the overall coordination of the war effort. Finally, just days before the brigade arrived in country, MACV decided where our unit would deploy, Cam Ranh Bay. There, the Screaming Eagles would secure large-scale construction activities that would eventually result in a first-class harbour, airbase, and other huge logistic facilities along the bay's 19-mile peninsula. It was at this time, when Hank Lund, Grady Jones and I went to recon the huge area for the first time and work out how to defend it, that the war really began for me in Vietnam. We borrowed a jeep from the Special Forces team, who were kindly hosting us at their camp at nearby Dong Ba Tin, and drove toward Cam Ranh Bay. The Green Beret intelligence sergeant had said Dong Ba Tin was a safe area, so we took our time. The weather was absolutely beautiful, and there was much to admire in the peaceful, lush green countryside. But as we drove along admiring it, the sultry afternoon air was punctured by the sound of a hidden automatic weapon suddenly sending a dozen slugs over our heads. We jumped out of the jeep in a hurry and went prone. All was quiet. We searched the area, but there was nothing to see. No sniper, no weapon, no tracks. It was almost as if we had imagined it, except that we hadn't. From this old trick, no different really than the Yugoslav sniper who had terrorized Jimmy Sparks and me in our guard box at Cormans almost 20 years before, I learned the first of many valuable lessons in the new war. There were no safe areas in Vietnam. Gradually, the brigade settled down. The soldiers got used to the jungle and its noises, and their shadow-shooting campaign died a slow but natural death. Quickly on its heels, however, came boredom. The men wanted to mix it up with Victor Charlie, the Viet Cong. "Those were such dull days," one of the brigade staff would later say. "I wondered if the war would ever start." I knew what he meant, even though we both knew the war was ongoing and all around us. There were just no front lines. The war was a sniper on the safe road near Dong Ba Tin, a child with a grenade, the old woman or young girl who sold Coca-Cola, ubiquitous features of the South Vietnamese landscape on the side of the road, who just happened to be simultaneously scoping out your positions and who spent her off hours planting booby traps. We encountered various hazards during our operations, such as manure-tipped bamboo stakes along patrol paths or crushed glass in the Coke we might be drinking. Both friends and enemies in Vietnam often spoke the same difficult tonal language, which few Americans understood. Enemy troops and non-combatants frequently wore similar clothes, leading to tragic and sometimes almost slapstick results. For example, 2 weeks into the country, when the brigade began conducting operations near the city of Nha Trang, one patrol netted a dozen armed VC in black pajamas. Only afterwards did we find out they were actually part of the Friendly Popular Forces, PF, a local militia that no one had informed us was operating there. Despite intelligence claims that the high ground overlooking Nha Trang was held by VC, we saw very few during the 5 major operations the 1st Brigade conducted in its first month in Vietnam. Instead, our guerrilla enemy seemed like an audience at a play in which we, the counter-guerrillas, were the unwitting actors. The VC sat in their darkened redoubts, watching and learning as we played out our roles on a well-lit stage. When the 1st Brigade of the 101st Airborne Division left Cam Ranh Bay in the last week of August, it was only the first of many moves. Our mission, in Colonel Timothy's words, was to serve as a reserve reaction force capable of airmobile or parachute assault anywhere in the theatre. We were to General Westmoreland what the Wolfhounds had been to Generals Walker and Ridgway in Korea 15 years before. Only the name had changed. Colonel Michaelis's Fire Brigade was now in honour of our commander, Colonel James S. Timothy. Over the next 6 months, the brigade travelled hundreds of miles by air, water and road to hotspots in South Vietnam. We went from the central highlands jungles of An Khê to the rice paddies of Quy Non, from the dusty Arizona-like landscape around Phan Rang to the rubber country of Lai Khe and Ben Cat. We secured the deployment of the 20,000-man strong 1st Air Cavalry Division and their 420-odd helicopters in Quy Non. We did the same for the Korean Capital Division, but that was the end of any similarity between the two missions. The move from An Khê to Quy Non could have been 1,000,000 miles. The two terrains and how Charlie fought in them were so different. In the highlands there were vast jungles complete with tigers and monkeys, and an enemy who, until our arrival, was systematically strangling the countryside, disrupting the economy by mining and cutting deep, impassable trenches in the roads. This prevented the rural community from getting its products to market. On the coast at Queenon, vast expanses of rice paddies, which we were tasked to protect, offered little cover and concealment for us, but somehow plenty for our cunning opponents, who whittled away at our ranks with snipers, booby traps, and the overwhelming support of the people. Lai Kay and Ben Cat were different yet again, with vicious mines and booby traps planted deep within virtually impenetrable double and triple canopied rubber tree jungles. Though only one major battle was fought during this 6-month period, the men of the 101st became more flexible, competent, and combat-savvy day by day. Queenon was probably the hardest for everyone. Though the brigade successfully opened up and secured Route 19 for the 1st Air Cav's deployment, it was not a fear-free walk in the sun. The road, linking Queenon on the coast with Anke and Pleiku in the Central Highlands, was the same one where Mobile Group 100, France's finest, had been annihilated 11 years before at the end of the Indochina War. The burned-out hulls of French vehicles still dotted both sides of the road, providing a sobering image for even the most gung-ho guys in the brigade. There was no small amount of whining about why the 101st had to hold the Air Cav's hand with vigorous, deep patrolling operations around their base camp while they shuttled their gear from Queenon to Lai Kay and got set up. After all, the troops griped, no one had patrolled and secured the base area at Cam Ranh Bay when the 1st Brigade arrived. In truth, the brigade's whining was less about real resentment of the Air Cav than a manifestation of their own frustration on those long, deep patrols. For the most part, the VC avoided contact. They just sat in the audience and studied the Yankees' patterns and procedures. For our troops, this generally meant endless hours of waiting for something to happen, and then usually little to nothing did, except perhaps a deadly encounter with a punji stake, a booby trap, or a sniper. Yet if something big did happen, the troops were as often as not paralyzed, not out of fear, but because of the MACV rules of engagement, specifically the one that precluded a US soldier from firing his weapon if not fired upon. One incident involved a 2nd Platoon B Company patrol, observing 5 or 6 VC sitting in the bush with their weapons propped up against a log. When Dennis Parker, the fire team leader who discovered them, informed his squad leader of the find. Dennis Parker, reminded of the strict rules of engagement, had to maneuver around to get the enemy's attention and make them reach for their weapons before he could fire. The result of the skirmish was 2 dead VC. Parker later wrote, "I would like to make it clear why it is hard for the American fighting men in Vietnam today. After fighting sharpened bamboo stakes, man traps, passing through several ambush sites, and seeing men with rifles, we still couldn't shoot first." A few nights later, one of our ambush patrols had an easier time when they took on an enemy force that had walked right into their killing zone. The platoon leader reported the contact to his battalion, which reported it to brigade. As S3, I relayed the information to Task Force Alpha headquarters at NHA Trang, which then reported it to Westmoreland at MACV headquarters in Saigon. Soon, the brigade S3 phone was running hot with questions from higher HQ. How many enemy? What kinds of weapons? What direction were they moving? The platoon leader, unable to see anything in the pitch-black night, tentatively reported some 10 or 12 enemy dead, with details to follow when daylight arrived. This report was satisfactory to battalion and brigade, but not to higher HQ. MACV continued to bug Task Force Alpha, and they had no choice but to pass on the request to brigade. It was reminiscent of Korea in 1952-53, only worse. To me, it was truly incomprehensible that some 4-star general would be getting all lathered up about a platoon ambush so cleanly executed that the enemy did not return a single round of fire. The barrage of questions continued until I had enough. From then on, every time I answered the S3 phone, I made sure I had my battery-operated electric razor in hand. "Okay," I'd say, "here's the latest on that contact. Are you ready to copy?" When they confirmed, I would hold the razor up to the phone. "Did you get all that?" If they responded with static on the line, I'd repeat, "An ambush patrol made contact at 3:30 hours." The Razor effectively kept us out of communication with higher HQ for the rest of the night. When day broke, the ambush team went out to search the killing zone. There were indeed 10 dead, a significant body count as it was known and stressed from above as a measure of success in Vietnam. However, all the dead were unarmed men, women, children, and old people. It turned out the ambush had been sprung on an unarmed family of montagnards, a nomadic people much like American Indians who lived throughout the highlands jungles of Vietnam and didn't adhere to curfews or the rule that all movement after sundown was to be considered enemy. The montagnard incident, like the rules of engagement and the frustration of not being able to engage a major VC unit, did little for morale. While the brigade was at An Khê, a contact on Route 19 yielded one enemy dead, carrying documents identifying him as a member of the 95th Battalion, 2nd VC Regiment. This discovery was a cause for celebration at brigade. Major Joe Hicks's S2 shop had been working overtime to locate the 95th, which we knew was operating somewhere around An Khê. With one of them killed along Route 19, we doubled our efforts to get a fix. There would be no mobile Group 100-style ambush sprung on the Screaming Eagle's 1st Brigade. The 95th was a force to be reckoned with, and the troops needed to overcome their boredom and frustration to have a chance at the VC and feel as though they were really in a war. As intelligence came in and began to form a pattern, the brigade continued to beat the bush. A Hawaiian cook in the E2 brought us our first substantial clue, a People's Army Vietnam Pia Vien troop he'd captured while scrounging for souvenirs during a patrol he joined for fun. The POW was a talkative guy who assured us his comrades were in the vicinity. Joe Hicks had him flown over the area to see if we could get an exact fix on where they were. Unfortunately, the POW was scared stiff on his first airplane ride and couldn't recognize his own belly button at 100 miles per hour, much less the battlefield on the ground below. Fortunately, around the same time, a USAF Forward Air Control (FAC) aircraft took fire from a .50 cal machine gun in the vicinity of what we believed, through radio intercepts, was our opponent's battalion command post. After that, we thought we had all the pieces of the puzzle and moved quickly to prevent the 95th from moving. Little did we know that our haste could not have led to more waste. Operation Yalta, the 101's first major confrontation with Charlie, kicked off as scheduled early on the morning of the 18th of September. 2 A-1 Skyraider airplanes prepared the single landing zone, LZ, with bombs, and the unit under the command of Wilfred Smith conducted an airmobile assault into a clearing in the village of An Khê. Insufficient troop lift helicopters meant the LZ had to be secured piecemeal, 3 platoons at a time. Insufficient planning time meant no one at brigade or battalion level had had a chance to scrutinize the aerial photographs received late the night before, which would have clearly shown that An Khê was not the wisest place to conduct an airmobile assault. The area around the LZ looked nothing more than an armed camp, as many comrades said. They wished the Americans would land directly in this area so they could deliver a long-remembered blow, claimed the author of a VC after-action report on Yalta captured months later. The report noted, "Their landing from helicopters in this area will be a golden opportunity for our unit to achieve merit because we do not have to move nor man any defences or spend sleepless nights. Their landing here means certain death for them." The anonymous scribe was not far wrong. The 2nd Battalion landed right in the middle of the 95th Battalion's training base. Their LZ was the very same dry rice paddy that VC troops used to train for defence against airmobile assaults. Although the first lift came in more or less unopposed, when the second lift arrived 15 minutes later, the LZ was an inferno. 2 helicopters were downed right there on the LZ. Wilford Rowe, CEO of B Company, was hit while still inside his chopper and was evacuated immediately. The 7 U.S. Marine helicopters, provided to augment elements of Lieutenant Colonel Cody's combat-seasoned 52nd Aviation Battalion, refused to land at all and instead took the troopers they were carrying back to the loading zone. A third lift onto an alternate LZ 800 metres away met with equally heavy ground fire. Alpha Company's CEO, Captain Gerald Landry, was hit as soon as he landed and was also immediately evacuated. The third lift managed to discharge only 36 men in 2 isolated units, totally cut off from each other and the elements of the other 2 lifts. Meanwhile, C Company's Captain RS, who had come in on the first lift, was killed by machine gun fire while rallying his troops to attack. Colonel Smith, who was pinned down behind a paddy wall, found himself without any company commanders and with fragments of companies fighting independently all over the battle area against a well-entrenched, well-equipped enemy who had rehearsed just such a contingency dozens of times. The VC had gotten their wish. Smith himself had come in on the second lift. "What's your situation, Colonel?" Timothy asked some minutes later from the Command and Control, CNC chopper, in which he, Joe Hicks and I were hovering above the battlefield. As soon as the ground commander established contact with us from the hot LZ, Smith cried, "We've got 13 dead." Timothy looked at me incredulously. "He can't have taken that many casualties in 5 minutes," I said. "Even if he could have, it would have been impossible for him to make any sort of accurate assessment in the time he had been on the ground under fire like that. Everything becomes exaggerated." My biggest fear in the CNC was that the colonel was going to lose complete control of himself as well as the battle, but as one of the 2nd Battalion officers opined later, Colonel Smith was never in control to lose it, and I believed it was true. From the moment the first elements of the 2nd Battalion hit the ground at Ankei, it seemed that anything that could possibly go wrong with the operation went wrong, and with a vengeance. The landing zone Smith had chosen was outside the range of our artillery. The task force's artillery was being held up on the wrong side of a mountain range due to roads bogged by heavy rain or cut by the Viet Cong. Smith had knowingly taken this risk of being beyond the artillery range. "I don't need artillery," he declared in response to Lieutenant Colonel William Brond's concern that Brond's airborne artillery would not be able to support Smith's assault. "I've got my TAC air." The only problem was, come the morning of the operation, Smith did not have his TAC air. After the first 2 A-1 Sky Raiders prepped the LZ and flew away, there was no TAC air at Ankei. A full hour and a half after the 2nd Battalion landed, it was discovered that the fuel for the A-1S had somehow been contaminated, and the planes were grounded until M-80V scrambled jets out of Bien Hoa to pick up the TAC air slack. The 2nd Battalion, minus helicopter gunships, was on its own. Meanwhile, up in our CNC bird, we received word that not one of the 26 troop-carrying choppers designated for this mission was still operational. All had taken multiple hits and could not fly. One of the faint-hearted suggested we tell the 2nd Battalion to escape and evade, forgetting completely that this situation was tailor-made for airborne. The airborne's very purpose was to drop behind enemy lines. Its men were trained to be surrounded and to fight in isolated pockets of resistance. So I called Grady Jones, who had been travelling with the waylaid task force in a jeep outfitted with all our maps and gear. He parked on the side of the road, popped smoke, and soon Timothy, Hicks and I joined him on the ground to decide what to do next. Colonel Timothy organised another task force composed of the remnants of the 2nd Companies that never made it to the battlefield and elements of the 23rd ARVN Ranger Battalion. Captain Dwayne Messer, the Rangers' senior advisor, was authorised to send only 2 of his companies. When he heard what a mess we were in, Captain Dwayne Messer brought the whole battalion anyway, and said he'd worry about the legalities later. We had to tap the 1st Air Cavalry for lift, with every troop-carrying chopper attached to us down. Their helicopters were the only immediate air assets in the vicinity. But when Bob Miller, the brigade S3 Air, called over to the Air Cav to request some helicopters, the Cav's chief of staff said, "No way!" "What do you mean, no way?" I yelled through the radio when Miller reported back to me. "That's what I said," he replied. I told him we had a battalion getting the crap kicked out of it to protect the 1st Cav's ass, and it would be a nice idea if they'd give us a little support. He said they didn't have flak jackets, and flying without them would violate all their SOPs. Later, I heard the Cav's real complaint was that our action would cheat them out of a few of the 30 precious combat-free days they'd been promised in-country to get themselves set up at NK. word travelled fast that we were getting zapped. Before long, Lieutenant General John Throckmorton, Westmoreland's deputy, flew up from Saigon to find out who was responsible for this disaster and what the hell we planned to do about it. By then we were locked and cocked, except for the air cav's assets. Timothy explained the situation to the general. Throckmorton made a few calls, and the next thing we knew, the flying horsemen of the 1st Air Cav came galloping to the rescue, sort of. For reasons unknown, the Cav dropped the 2nd Task Force, Task Force Collins, named for the CO, at an LZ not 2 kilometres from Anke, as Colonel Timothy had chosen. This destroyed any hope of their linking up with and taking the heat off the 2nd Battalion at all. That day, 2 daring Air Cav pilots did manage to get much-needed ammo resupply and a mortar into the battle zone, and were able to evacuate 5 wounded before they had to break off due to heavy enemy fire. "The choppers weren't even landing," said one participant after the fight. "We were just throwing bodies on the ground." The battle was fought by the NCOs, who had become the commanders by default, as the officers were one by one killed or seriously wounded, and Colonel Smith remained pinned down behind his paddy wall. But the biggest sting of the fight was word that Herb Dexter, who had only recently transferred from Brigade S4 to the 2nd Battalion as S3, was also killed in this, his 4th tour in Vietnam. He too had become a platoon leader in the effort to turn the battle around. He was hit 5 times as he led a small band of courageous paratroopers up a heavily fortified enemy-held hill that dominated the landing zone. "Don't pull back, don't pull back," he said as he died, and his men heeded him, taking the objective a short time later in hand-to-hand combat, with one brave trooper even storming an enemy mortar and ripping its sights off with his bare hands. The guys who were probably best off were the 36 who'd come in on the 3rd lift. Though under constant attack and cut off from one another in groups of 8 and 28 men until noon, and then cut off together from the main body of the battalion for the rest of the day, these men were in the good hands of platoon sergeants Robert Jack and Robert Whitman, 2 old soldiers with years of combat experience. Whitman had actually found himself in and fought himself out of a virtually identical cut-off situation a dozen years before in Korea. The 2nd Battalion troops performed magnificently throughout the battle, but never more so than in the early crucial hours. In the absence of air support, artillery and commanders, they survived their baptism of fire with sheer guts. At one stage, late in the day, a recon man named Freeman even took 5 prisoners with his disassembled M16. The weapon had jammed, and he was cleaning it when he saw a VC patrol approaching him. He jumped up, pointed the barrel assembly at them, and they threw up their hands. He marched them into his unit's nighttime perimeter. Fortunately for all concerned, by mid-afternoon, TAC air was in abundance. Bob Miller had so many planes stacked up, he had to provide alternate targets throughout the battlefield just to unload the ordnance. The first day's 47 airstrikes punished Charles royally, suppressed a lot of his fire, and let our troops come up for air. But close-in requests within 100 metres of friendly positions during the belly-to-belly fighting accounted for 2 B Company deaths and a number of injuries throughout the day. By nightfall, the Air Cav had lifted the artillery into range of Anke at our request. They also set up one of their own batteries nearby to support Task Force Collins, which was beyond the fan, and mistakenly proceeded to blast the crap out of Collins's CP. It wasn't the Cav's fault. In the hurry and the heat of the battle, no one had thought to make sure they used the same artillery deflection. Obviously they did not, and it was just luck that among the 11 friendly casualties that resulted from the accident, no one was killed. That night, flare ships circled overhead, keeping the area lit up like day. By morning, the VC had gone to ground. Operation Gibraltar continued for 2 more days, with the 2nd Battalion being extracted and Task Force Collins mopping up the area. The worst was over, with the net result of the fighting being 13 US casualties, KIA, and 40 wounded, 12 of which were from friendly fire. The enemy body count was reported as 257 KIA, most of whom were victims of our TAC air. Only 21 enemy weapons were recovered, but 12 prisoners were taken, some of whom were unquestionably hardcore NVA regulars. These prisoners had infiltrated to join VC main force units and bolster their southern counterparts. So much for North Vietnam's chant, "No NVA troops south of the 17th parallel." General Westmoreland, along with about 20 reporters, was at brigade headquarters at An Khe when the 2nd Battalion was extracted. Colonel Smith was immediately flown there to meet him, give his report, and quash early press accounts that the 2nd Battalion had been badly mauled at An Khe. The following day, Smith was flown to Saigon to address the press there. Despite being pinned down throughout the first bloody day and destroying most of his documents in anticipation of being overrun, Smith would receive a Silver Star for gallantry in action during the operation. His battalion was awarded a well-deserved Presidential Unit citation, though less for their tactical brilliance than for their guts and absolute refusal to give in. How lucky the unit actually was in the earliest moments of the battle to survive what ended up being the buzzsaw of a well-trained, well-armed main force VC unit would not be known until the 1st Air Cav captured that VC after-action report on Gibraltar some 6 months later. According to that document, the VC knew we were coming as soon as we started planning. The minute we'd informed the friendly Viets in the district that we were going into the area, the word was passed along to the VC. The 95th also had a pretty good idea of where we would be landing, and for 2 days before the battle they trained on positions there. However, since nothing ever goes exactly according to plan, the VC, as prepared as they had been to receive us, were caught somewhat by surprise when the 2nd Battalion made its initial airmobile assault. Huge pots of still-boiling rice, ammo, and other gear found by our troops in hastily abandoned enemy campsites told the tale. The VC after-action report filled in a noteworthy blank. As the initial airstrikes and the 1st 2nd Battalion lift went in, all the VC leaders from squad level on up were at their battalion CP, engrossed in a sand table exercise of the expected battle. The airstrikes cut the phone wires between the battalion commander and his companies, and throughout the subsequent fighting, the VC troops fought as isolated bands with no guidance from their main boss. At the outset of the battle, until the squad, platoon and company leaders got back to their units from the battalion CP, the VC troops fought with no guidance at all. One irony of this could be seen in a story related after the battle by 2nd Battalion recon man John Reed. Soon after they landed as part of the first lift, a number of 2nd Battalion recon guys saw a dozen Viet Cong in black pyjamas tearing across the river just beyond a tree line north of the LZ. The recon group opened fire, only to be stopped by their sergeant because the enemy did not appear to be armed. It was General Westmoreland's strict rules of engagement again, and these VC got away, but they were never identified. The question would always remain, what if they had been among the unit's platoon and company commanders? How different would the battle have been if our recon guys had killed them, and the enemy lost all its key leaders, just as the 2nd Battalion had lost theirs? Operation Gibraltar, the first major battle waged by the US Army in Vietnam, was hailed by General Westmoreland as a great victory for US troops. To me, Gibraltar was many things. Chief among them was a learning experience about the necessity of artillery, the allowance of sufficient lead time before an operation, and the worth of airborne training, even if airborne operations themselves were obsolete against a sophisticated enemy with TAC air and tactical nuclear weapons. Instilling as it did the "they've got us surrounded, the poor bastards" fighting spirit, it served the 2nd Battalion troopers on the ground at An Khe in fine stead. But one thing Gibraltar most definitely was not was a great victory. Later, one daring officer participant diplomatically called it a blundering success. Another was a little more blunt when he said, "The VC saved the day by walking away," which, not at all to downplay the spirit and performance of the 2nd Battalion soldiers or the professionalism of its NCOs, was indeed the case. Still, the great victory at Gibraltar sounded the start gun for many more big battles and many more great victories for American units in Westmoreland's search-and-destroy war of attrition. While the 1st Brigade had learned plenty to arm it for the next confrontation with Charlie, so of course had the VC. Because of the tremendous losses in helicopters during Gibraltar, extracting troops from Ankei was a slow, complicated, piecemeal process. Still, Bob Miller, the S3A and a truly exceptional officer, had things under control. The redeployment was going smoothly when Major Charles W. Bill Dyke, S3, burst through the tent flaps of our S3 tent demanding assets to get his battalion out of the battle area. Bill Dyke was a hard-charging, super-conscientious officer, so conscientious, in fact, that he always looked on the verge of going tilt. He reminded me of an overbred hunting dog, so finely tuned that all it could do was shake. As far as I was concerned, Dyke was not the kind of personality we needed around at the moment. Most of the staff hadn't slept in 3 days, and tempers were reasonably short. I was holding on by a hair trigger. Nonetheless, Dyke came charging in, demanding priority on air support. My primary concern was getting the unit back to pre-Gibraltar station. Miller went on organising just that, with Dyke breathing hot and heavy down his neck. Finally, I said, "Okay, Dyke, we're ready to outload your damn battalion." "Don't call my battalion a damn battalion!" Dyke screamed in reply. Before I knew it, he came charging at me like a red-faced raging bull. Automatically, I put up my dukes, and the second he was in range, I hit him, not once but 3 or 4 times, and knocked him on his arse right then and there. After he got his bearings, Dyke slowly got up from the deck and grabbed my hand. "Hack," he said, shaking it wildly. "You're a better man than I." What a weird guy, I thought to myself, as he madly pumped away on my hand. This is one weird guy. By the time the 1st Brigade left for Quan, the men were well on their way to becoming seasoned veterans. Gibraltar had bloodied us and taught us to respect our foe. Overall confidence had steadily risen, both through countless patrols and company and battalion-sized operations, and from observing the predominantly non-paratrooper 1st Air Cav guys going through their opening night jitters. How quickly our men had forgotten their own comments like, "What were you all shooting at last night, Leg?" which had been heard from the moment the Air Cav arrived. Now, on the eve of our departure, it had given way to, "Hey, Leg, what are you going to do when we're not here to protect your ass?" About the same time that we moved out of Ankei, Colonel Timothy made good on the promise he'd made me as far back as Fort Campbell about letting me go down to the Above the Rest battalion. I was thrilled. Brigade staff was no place for a warrior, though I enjoyed working for Colonel Timothy very much. From the way things were shaping up, the war in Vietnam was fought almost solely at platoon, company, and battalion levels. A staff officer at brigade, division, and above was nothing more than a manager's assistant, a small cog in a huge paper-shuffling machine, whose function was little more than matching assets against requirements and writing reports. I probably would have been happy with any job just to get off the brigade staff, so when Timothy told me I was going to the Above the Rest battalion as executive officer, it was like a dream come true. It was head and shoulders above the other 2 battalions. It was a close-knit, spirited crew, a unit that well reflected its long history of strong leadership. Since the new CO, Joe Rogers, had already been my immediate superior as Brigade XO for almost a year, it was yet another break for me. There was no time or energy lost having to establish or prove myself with my new boss. A Battalion XO actually wore 2 hats. One was that of Battalion Chief of Staff, and the other that of Deputy Commander of the battalion. As Chief of Staff, the XO's main responsibilities were to ramrod the battalion staff and run the administrative and logistics side of the unit. As Deputy Commander, a hat that had to be worn most carefully, if the XO made sure he adhered to the good guy or bad guy role his CO tasked him to play, the differentiation of roles between the pair was essential. He could find himself an integral part of a damn good command team. For example, since Colonel Rogers was an unassuming, relaxed intellectual and I was a hard-driving son of a gun, we fell very naturally into our respective roles in the running of the battalion. Like Colonel Couch to Colonel Johns and the Vanguards, I snapped the whip, and Rogers applied the salve. Though generally the commander played the bad guy, our arrangement suited me right down to the ground. On top of anything else, it gave me leave to kick ass and take names and to hammer in the basics. From the first day I walked into the battalion, it was fire and manoeuvre, weapons clean and within arm's reach, wearing steel pots and proper camouflage. All these were things the troops knew, but they'd gotten lazy about them during 2 months on the battlefield, and laziness could kill. For the 40 days the brigade spent in the Quang area, the period was characterized by snipers and booby traps, mines and monsoons, and one rice paddy after another. The paddies all looked alike and made navigation hell. On one occasion, a company landed on 2 separate rice paddy LZs, only to find both were wrong. Booby traps were responsible for many casualties during this period. The enemy had an incredible array of them, which they attached to doorways of vacant houses and shrines, on gates, and especially along the tops of paddy walls. There were hand grenade booby traps with one or multiple tripwires secured to trees and rocks. There were more grenades, pins removed, held tight by a bag of rice, a rock, or a potential souvenir, like a VC flag, for example, that were activated simply by picking up the item under which the primed grenade lay. Some of the best VC booby traps were made from US Air Force Dud cluster bomblets, modified with a pressure device and buried just below ground level to blow when a trooper stepped on them, or Dud mortar rounds buried nose up. Similarly, pressure-detonated devices were common. The VC used anything careless American soldiers left behind, see ration cans for example, as the basis for many lethal enemy devices. Even deadlier were the items the VC would give back from time to time, like US grenades they had recovered on the battlefield. A less than savvy American trooper might pick up one of these seemingly abandoned grenades and add it to his kit. Days or weeks later, he might use it and find himself dead the second he pulled the pin. The VC who found it first had replaced it on the battlefield only after removing the delay. This sort of thing really played with the troopers' minds. It was hell never knowing if you were going to lose a foot with your next step. It also gave rise to enormous frustration and anger among them. They seldom saw Charlie at Quang, though he was actually much more plentiful there than he had been at An Khe. Yet every day Charlie was bleeding them. They would go into villages almost completely bereft of males, and after the women and old men had explained that all their husbands and sons were in the army or dead, and that there were no VC there, our soldiers would move on a few 100 meters, only to have one of their number killed or wounded by a sniper hiding up in the village they had just left. The vast majority, up to 80%, of the heavily populated countryside was supportive of or influenced by the VC. Add to this the fact that the enemy at Quang was a far more cunning and evasive opponent than he had been at An Khe, and his strategy of hit and run was all too effective. The coastal monsoons made things even more grim. With the onset of the rainy season, the flat, open rice paddies, already sniper booby trap and punji stick-infested, became like rivers. At one stage, the brigade CP was actually washed away when it was set up on ground too low. While Fred Johnson's SEA company used captured sands to improve their mobility through the flooded paddies, Johnson was an invaluable asset to the battalion as the only officer who had been to Vietnam before. He was our continuity link to the war. Most of the troops just sloshed through the chest-deep water with their weapons held over their heads, simultaneously trying to fight an unseen enemy who could see them for miles. Immersion foot, a condition where continuously wet feet blister and then become a mass of painful ulcers, quickly became a serious problem among the men. The only remedy was to pull the sufferer out of the field and make him wear flip-flops, aka Ho Chi Minh sandals, until his feet dried out. It was hard to disagree with the sentiments expressed in a captured VC document from this period that US troops walked in the open and looked like bewildered ducks. The only consolation was that whoever wrote the thing had gone on to say that in action we ran slowly and looked funny. He had obviously never seen Lieutenant Harry the Horse Godwin. A platoon leader in Abu Company, Godwin began his legend at Quang. After deploying his best sharpshooters, this 6'3" Marine and top college athlete, Henderson State producer of studs, just to name two, would get on top of rice paddy walls and run. The purpose of the exercise was to get a concealed VC sniper to take a shot at him. Then, as the long-legged basketball star kept on running, his sharpshooters would nail the sniper. The scheme worked very well, but as cat-and-mouse games go, it was altogether too dangerous. I quietly told George Shevin, the capable skipper, to put a good harness on the horse and rein him in. Even so, I couldn't help but admire old Harry and wish his legend well. He was a top combat leader and a soldier revered by his men. I was not involved in many combat activities while my new battalion was at Quang, but I was involved in a few battles, most notably with the 1st Brigade staff, which I managed to alienate within about 2 minutes of leaving there and joining the battalion. The problem began when I realized that, on the user level, the battalion was playing guinea pig for the research and development, R&D people back in the States. It was not unlike the German army's scheme almost 30 years before, when the Spanish Civil War became the Nazis' R&D field laboratory. Every time I turned around, our unit was being given some new piece of equipment to test on the battlefield. We at the battalion had to send the untried wonder gear down to a company commander who would give it to an appropriate user. The user would try it out and report his results back to his skipper, who would make a verbal report that would be formalized at Battalion S3 and sent on to Brigade. The first to suffer for this game was the user tester, who, concurrent with his efforts to adjust to and fight the war, was being made to fumble around with equipment he'd never seen before and had no confidence in. At company level, people were already terribly overworked, and the net result of this sort of testing was snap judgments on costly and often critical equipment, not to mention enough related paperwork to drown the whole war effort. As Battalion XO, I did not agree that our job was to be an extension of DA's R&D or to answer mail from higher HQ just because they sent it. "You will not answer that. We will not make that report," I'd tell my people when unreasonable requirements were sent down. "We are here to fight a war. Our primary purpose is to kick Charlie's ass, not to write reports." I was particularly annoyed with Hansen, with whom I'd swapped jobs. Though it was only natural for him to send little projects down to his old unit, it was a constant source of frustration. I really felt he laid altogether too many requirements on us. On top of that, since he knew all the good people in my battalion from his IXO days, it seemed as though every other damn day he and Jim Wilson, who was now the Brigade XO, were stealing Evans and Scooter Burke, two of the best, from the Brigade S3, and taking them to work in their already overstaffed Brigade HQ. One afternoon, a stinging reply by endorsement came down from Brigade, demanding an evaluation report on the feasibility and desirability of the over and under. The RBI landed on the desk of the Battalion Operations Officer, Major Don Hilbert. "Look," he said, "they're yelling for this report. What's the priority?" I grabbed the RBI. "Don't worry about it. I'll do it." I was furious. Where did they think they were, Fort Benning? If I attempted to answer the mass of feudal correspondence that surrounded me, I'd be debarred from all serious business of campaigning. Wellington once wrote, I mused as I jammed a piece of paper into a typewriter, wondering what exactly he did with the stuff he didn't answer, and, more importantly, how he'd gotten away with it. I pounded on the keys, the octopus. I banged the carriage return so hard I thought it would break off. Subject: I continued the performance of the over and under and proceeded to report that this Rube Goldberg wonder weapon, which was an M16 with an M79 fixed underneath, was an ineffective, undesirable piece of crap. I ripped the rough draft out of the typewriter and gave it to the clerk to finalize, forgetting completely that it was addressed to the octopus instead of the commanding officer, 1st Airborne Brigade. So the kid typed it up as it was. I only read through the text of the message and off it went. Thank God the commanding officer was Colonel Timothy. Over the last year we had developed a wonderful relationship. He was an infinitely patient man who, as a caring father would with his wayward son, took great pains to try to smooth out my character. A dinner we shared in Hawaii, for example, on our way back from the Vietnam recon in May, became Colonel Timothy's opportunity to work on my manners. We both ordered chicken, and while the Colonel properly cut his into bite-sized pieces, I picked mine up and started hoeing it down with gusto. Tim was able to ignore this, but I guess when I started licking my fingers, it got to be too much for him. "Dave," he said gently. "Gentlemen do not eat chicken with their fingers in Vietnam." Since he'd sent me down, Colonel Timothy always backed me up and bore the whining of his brigade staff about me. The octopus memo, however, was one step too far. "You have no idea how close I was to relieving you," Tim snapped when I saw him soon after. "There you were, calling me your commanding officer an octopus." "Well, you are an octopus," I replied, feeling a little bad. After all, Timothy had his own octopus to contend with. The lion's share of his time was spent briefing VIPs like the Secretary of Defense and visiting senators, congressmen, and others. Their headquarters was always coming down here with their long tentacles and wrapping them around us, strangling us with red tape so we couldn't get on with our job. Then they whip in again and steal all our best people. The minute we get a man trained and looking good, somebody decides he's wanted at your headquarters. "That is not the issue, Dave." "It is the issue, sir." As with all my run-ins with Colonel Timothy, this one soon passed, and he even thumped his people for raiding our good men. There wasn't much he could do about the R&D testing requirements, however, and the battalion continued to play guinea pigs for many new toys, few of which were practical or applicable to what we were doing in this war. That was my real problem with the Buck Rogers Wonder Junk Laboratory team. We were an unwilling part of the rotten M16. For example, which we had brought over with us, was still a real sore point with me, and quickly became one for the warriors whose lives depended on it working. Many troopers picked up Soviet AK-47S off the battlefield, or lugged heavier M4S or Thompson submachine guns, anything to avoid the M16, which still wasn't foolproof and jammed more than it fired. Even when it was working, the M16 wasn't worth a tinker's dam in the bush. Though its projectile was incredibly lethal when it struck a human target, it was easily deflected by vines, bamboo, and other undergrowth. What good, I kept asking, was a weapon that couldn't hack the jungle when we were fighting a jungle war? Since a competent soldier is first and foremost a confident soldier, how the hell were these kids expected to perform well carrying a weapon they couldn't trust? The same questions applied to the M72 light anti-tank weapon, which had an electrical firing mechanism that completely shorted out if any moisture developed inside it in the hot, humid conditions of Vietnam. Half the time, a guy would be better off throwing that weapon at the enemy than trying to fire it. Ditto the radio handset, which was so fragile it virtually fell apart when you blew on it, and was so susceptible to moisture that it had to be wrapped in plastic to keep it dry. The R&D people didn't always get it wrong. The PRC-25 radio, for example, and its handset were first class and totally reliable. The R&D guys did produce the M79 grenade launcher, the finest infantry weapon fielded since the BR Colonel George Couch helped develop this compact, lightweight, reliable miracle, which ensured that infantry would never again have to find itself pinned down 50 metres from an entrenched machine gun position, too far away to toss a grenade, too close for artillery, and nearly impossible to reach and knock out without severe casualties with the M79. One well-placed H-round could do the trick. The M79 also fired shotgun shells, which made it an excellent area fire weapon, well loved by point men. At night, unlike the M16 with the shotgun shell, the M79 could penetrate the bush. This led many resourceful troopers to carry both weapons at all times, the M79 to tear a hole through the jungle, and the M16 to fight in the resultant clearing. Conceptually, this made the over and under combo a winner too. But like everything else, the weapon, half of which, the M16, had enough problems of its own to be worked out, was being sent down to troops before anyone had even begun to address its teething problems or basic bugs. By 1965, the over and under was a malfunctioning suicide weapon in the hands of a young soldier. But that didn't stop us from getting them to test more and more as over and unders, laws, and all the other too often useless or dangerous wonder gear poured in from the States to be tested on the ground. Basic essential things seldom found their way to the troops. A perfect example was the hand grenade pouch. Ever since Matt Ridgway wore an uncovered frag grenade on his harness in Korea as a showmanship trick, it seemed we hadn't had a secure way to carry grenades. Despite conditions on the ground in Vietnam pleading for such an item, such as self-inflicted casualties arising from grenade pins catching on jungle vines and being pulled out while unsuspecting troopers walked along, R&D and logistics people did not take the time to look and see for themselves. The soldiers, of course, made do. The canteen cover, which we'd used in Korea to carry extra frags, became the grenade pouch in Vietnam too. But the soldiers doing the fighting shouldn't have had to make do for grenade pouches or anything else. It was this truth that made the priority given to R&D the most incomprehensible, especially in the first few months we were in Vietnam. We had laws and M16s out the arse, which would have been a godsend if we could have counted on them to work. But in every other way, the logistic support we received during this period was criminally inadequate. General Westmoreland had made a bold decision to send combat troops to Vietnam with no logistics tail to speak of. It was true that at the time we arrived, the roads between all provinces and most districts in the highlands had been cut, and the war effort there and throughout South Vietnam was on the edge of collapsing to the Viet Cong. But this fact meant little to the troopers of the 1st Brigade, 101st, who were on canned sea rations for 3 solid months. There were now 125,000 Americans in Vietnam, with the number ever growing, but there were few cleaning rods or gun patches and little preservative oil for the line soldiers' weapons. About the only thing the logistics people made sure there was an ample supply of was beer for the troops to drink. While I was still at brigade, Grady Jones had finally given up his in-country search for tyres for our S3 Jeep. He wrote to his wife in America, and she sent him 2 by mail. He got them. Our stateside fatigues were too hot for tropical operations. The troopers' first-rate cork-ran leather jump boots had begun to fall apart within 2 weeks of training around in the jungle. The leather cracked from the dampness, and the soles fell off. With no resupply, the result was many soldiers going into battle in scuffed sneakers or with their boots held together with com wire and tape. Early in the piece, when General Westmoreland came up to give the 101 troopers a pep talk, even he was shocked by the condition of their boots. The next day, he sent up dozens of pairs of proper jungle boots from Saigon, taken, I was told, right off the feet of the rear echelon commandos at MAKV, who had an abundance of everything while we lived like Washington's forces at a humid valley forge. When, as newly appointed XO, I walked into the battalion for the first time, I was appalled by the lack of just about everything. Fortunately for me in the battalion, though I didn't know it at the time, the battalion S4, whom I'll call Captain Tom Hancock, and whom I summoned to tell I wanted this situation changed pronto, was one of the greatest wheeler dealers in the US Army. All he'd been waiting for was a green light. I'd met Tom Hancock at Fort Campbell when I was a Tagon on one of his platoon jumps. Back then, he'd been a cheerful, gung-ho second lieutenant, a distinguished military graduate who ran one damn fine platoon. After the jump, I'd written his name down in my People to Watch and Grab Later book. Even so, it was just good luck that I'd ended up with him in the 327, and even better that, in the words of one of his peers, Hancock made an art form out of stealing. I don't care how you do it or where you get it, but we need it now. Don't tell me your troubles, just get it done. Hancock was not the only one caught up in the scamming spirit I instilled in the battalion's leaders, a carryover from Fort Mac and my D Company Vanguard days, but he was by far the best. One of his first acquisitions at Kennan was a real coup, an ice machine for the troops set up right on the beach. Ice was cold gold in South Vietnam's blistering summer heat. From the moment we arrived at Cam Ranh Grand Bay, our greedy South Vietnamese allies had taken full advantage of our need for it, raising the price in the first week from about $1 to $100 a block. While it would later be said of Hancock that stealing was a narcotic to him, he just stole and then stole that much more. I like to think of my master sergeant as Robin Hood in fatigues, scamming at my direction for the troops of our destitute battalion. The thing was, we could all have accepted the lean times if they had applied to everyone, but they didn't. MAKV, USAF, and Army Service and Support units lived in Fat City, while we struggled to get the basics. Then they had the balls to look down on our people when we dared to ask for a few crumbs, or to go to their snazzy clubs in attire that did not meet their standards. As a result, as far as I was concerned, survival was the only law of the land. Our combat units just took what they needed to ensure the troops' welfare was looked after. When I told Hancock, for example, that I wanted the battalion to have a decent hot meal when the companies returned from the next Quan operation, I wanted steak, chicken and potatoes, not stuff out of a can. For Christ's sake, they had been on sea rations forever. Hancock, who'd once been a general's aide, put on his aide-de-camp insignia, commandeered a small boat, and motored out to a ship in the Quan harbour. He told the captain he represented the general and needed some steaks, etc., for a VIP show for some Vietnamese. Whether the ship's captain was more impressed with Hancock or with the souvenir gifts of captured weapons the S4 presented was hard to judge, but he gave Hancock everything he wanted, ×3. When the troops next got back from the patties, the wonderful smell of grilled steaks and barbecued chicken was wafting through the camp to greet them. Hancock had scored an extra load of beer too, and before long one slightly mellow, very happy battalion was moving through the chow line, courtesy of Tom Hancock. Unfortunately, one of the cooks had received a Dear John letter that morning and chose the middle of the party as the moment to blow his brains out. He lay down on the ground, stuck an M16 in his mouth, and let loose on full automatic. Though I wasn't there at the time, word had it that his hungry fellow troopers, deprived of decent food for so long, didn't miss a lick. Like the rest of the battalion, Hancock's understanding was that I'd cover for him if he got caught red-handed. Unlike the understanding I had with the other battalion scroungers, however, I found myself covering for Hancock in all kinds of ways, for all kinds of activities, including the time he walked into a Quan bar, told a few legs there that they'd better leave, and when they didn't, he shot an M79 through the bar window. At the time, I was just thankful he wasn't drunk. When he was drunk, he was much worse. Hancock's enthusiasm for the ladies got him into even more trouble. We called him Peeping Tom when he was on the prowl, which was most of the time, and since he didn't seem to be able to do anything halfway, he fell in love fast and very, very frequently. His only failing was a somewhat indiscriminate bent. Had I known about this before the war, I would have loaded up on shares in companies that manufactured penicillin. All in all, I quickly realized Peeping Tom Hancock was going to be a handful, but maybe because he reminded me a lot of myself when I was a hell-raising kid, I put up with the bad to get the best out of the good, and the two of us got along fine. By the time the brigade left Quan, it had been on continuous missions for 100 days. Our next stop was Phan Rang, home of the 11th 101's new permanent base camp for a much-deserved rest. The Quan mission, codenamed Nam Sayonara, had been very successful. Not only had we held the Korean Capital Division's hand until they set up and got through the same opening night heebie-jeebies we and the 1st Air Cav had had, but we'd allowed the local people to harvest their rice in peace, unmolested by the Viet Cong. As well, the brigade had captured hundreds of tons of the stuff from VC caches while pushing the enemy back into the hinterland. The casualties at Quan had been mostly the result of VC snipers, mines and booby traps, with friendly fire accounting for the remainder. In the Above the Rest battalion, we'd taken a total of 15 KIA and 51 WIA, the most tragic losses being in the recon platoon, where 5 were killed and 4 wounded when the platoon leader erroneously adjusted US mortar fire right onto his own position. Gastroenteritis and malaria had also taken their toll at Quan. Some slackers saw these illnesses as a way out of the war and, not unlike the Korea days, went out of their way to drink rice paddy and well water without HZ tablets, or did not take their anti-malaria pills. Then went around inviting mosquitoes with their sleeves rolled up and shirts unbuttoned. When the sun went down, the malaria situation got so bad that we finally issued an order that squad leaders had to administer the huge anti-malaria horse pills to each trooper personally and record the event in a notebook. Phan Rang gave the troopers a chance to relax and have a few beers while the battalion organisation went through a major reshuffle. All but one company commander was replaced, and a new 4th manoeuvre element was established. The company command shake-up was not by choice. It was instead based on the Army Vietnam policy that a company CO's command tour was to be 3 months long. The philosophy behind this policy, which ended up being a policy of command musical chairs, was to spread command experience around with the long-term view of having an army full of experienced combat commanders. In practice, however, the policy only prevented a man from becoming a good commander and leader. Just as he began to get the hang of the role, to get to know his troops and understand how to employ them, he was yanked off the line. Meanwhile, the troops had no continuity, and if a wimp replaced a stud, good or bad, the best or the worst, unless a guy was relieved, he stayed with his unit. Morale and fighting confidence could plummet overnight. It was a terrible way to run a combat unit, but it was the rule. So at Phan Rang, there wasn't much we could do except make the changes and hope the new guys had what it took. A more welcome adjustment to the battalion at this time was the establishment of an all-volunteer raider-like unit called the Tiger Force. The Tiger's personnel assets came from our recon and anti-tank platoon, which at Quan I'd recommended to Colonel Rogers that we inactivate. Rogers agreed that we had little requirement for anti-tank weapons. The unit's vehicles made them road-bound anyway. The Tiger Force troopers, in their distinctive Special Forces Tiger suit fatigues permanently camouflaged with black and brown stripes and secured from the Green Berets by Hancock, gave the battalion a long-range reconnaissance and ambush element. They operated independently and provided the flexibility of a handy fourth manoeuvre element. The need for and value of a fresh concept like the Tigers was intensified in the battalion by virtue of recent goings-on. Wilfred Smith was gone now, and Lieutenant Colonel Henry Everett Hank Gerson was in charge, breathing fire into the Z2 and implementing a kit bag of bold ideas. There's nothing like unit competition to shake off the cobwebs, and we knew that unless we got off our asses, the above the rest would soon be below the best. Lieutenant Jim Gardner, most recently the recon platoon leader, became the first Tiger CO. He was a hard-working, red-headed Dyersburg, Tennessee-born Irishman, a natural leader whose gentle demeanour belied the cocky, profane Tigers he helped create. Gardner was a no-nonsense kind of guy. The story went that he'd been kicked out of West Point after turning himself in for violating the Academy's strict honour code. Undeterred, he'd gone to OCS and been commissioned a few months before his West Point peers. He had loads of common sense, rare among young lieutenants, and truly loved his soldiers. Unfortunately, the latter attribute would have him blaming himself the rest of his life for the 5 recon platoon deaths at Quan when he'd mistakenly put mortar fire onto his own position. In any event, Gardner was my kind of man. He had no trouble getting volunteers for the new outfit either, and soon had organised and begun to train his very mean 2-platoon Tiger Force. As soon as things were squared away, Captain Raphael Benjamin, our new battalion surgeon, checked me into the hospital at Nha Trang. I'd picked up a severe case of gastroenteritis at Kenan, probably from drinking Vet 33 beer, rumoured to be made in part from formaldehyde. I'd been sick for a couple of weeks, and even the unquestionably brilliant new doc hadn't been able to bring it under control. As events proved, the docs in the hospital couldn't either, despite an entire week under their care. While they poked and prodded and scratched their heads trying to figure out what had gotten to me, I watched my near-empty officers' ward fill to capacity with casualties, all from the LST Air Cav and all from a single battle, the Battle of the Ia Drang. The first casualties in were from Lieutenant Colonel Harold Hal G. Moore's Gary Owen Battalion. The stories they told of their baptism of fire began as echoes of jolter, inadequate lift and piecemeal commitment. Landing virtually at the enemy's front door and being incredibly outnumbered, the first day found Moore's understrength unit, little more than 50%, surrounded and caught in a vice of 2+ NVA battalions. The second day was more of the same, except that the 2, possibly 3 North Vietnamese battalions assaulting the weary 1/7th were entirely fresh troops. The enemy made their main attack into Moore's company, inflicting heavy casualties and rendering that brave band of men ineffective as a fighting force. But the survivors hung tough and held their ground. Savage hand-to-hand combat was the order of the day as the enemy closed as tight as they could to avoid the aircav's superior firepower. Close-in employment of artillery and tactical air severely punished the NVA troops, but took its toll in friendly casualties too. The worst case was when a canister of USAF napalm was mistakenly dropped just 20 meters from Moore's CP, scorching many and burning to death one of the troopers dug in there. Despite these dire stories I heard in my hospital bed, Moore's Ayar Drang fight did not smell like a disaster or a blundering success like Jalta. While Moore would later describe his battalion's fight as a fight-to-live situation, which was not unlike what the Z-02 had experienced, a critical difference between the two battles was that the commander of the 1/7th was completely in control from the moment his fight began. At An Khe, Colonel Smith was denied this control by going in with the second lift of troops. Moore, on the other hand, had been on the first lift in the lead chopper. He'd made sure he had a chance to eyeball the LZ and the terrain surrounding it before the fight broke. Hal Moore was a comer in the army. By the grade of lieutenant colonel, an officer's reputation was generally made or broken, and if the guy's a comer at that point, he starts being described as 1-star or 3-star, that is, what rank he'll achieve before being retired arbitrarily in keeping with the Army's senseless AG rules. At the time of the Ayar Drang fight, Hal Moore was already being described as an all-the-way man, meaning 4 stars and probably Chief of Staff one day. That reputation was only enhanced by his performance at Ia Drang, where he fought his battalion brilliantly against incredible odds, taking severe casualties but inflicting even worse ones on the enemy. This included a spectacular coup de grace just before his battalion was relieved and extracted from the ground they'd fought over for 40-odd hours. Using the sixth sense he developed over years and years of troop-leading experience and plenty of combat, just as dawn was breaking, Moore ordered a controlled mad minute with every available weapon in the battalion blazing. The net result was the annihilation of an NVA company, cut down in their attack positions just moments before they were set to launch an assault on Moore's unit. As the week passed, Ia Drang casualties continued pouring into the hospital at Nha Trang, but the mood of these my latest wardmates was as grave as Moore's men's had been elated. They were members of Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade's Cav Battalion, which had relieved Moore's forces. That very same morning they walked right into an estimated 500-man NVA ambush. The word I was getting from the wounded air cav officers was disaster, annihilation, almost to the man, of 27 units as big as company size. Despite this, and despite the fact that American KIAs would number more than 200 by the time the battle ended a little more than a week later, both at the height of the fighting and when it was over, Kus Maeve, General William Westmoreland's confidant, stated that the Battle of Ia Drang was an unprecedented victory for American units in the war. Victory is one of those words as hard to define as light, moderate, and heavy. 3 more of those words that MACV had chosen as the official terms to describe friendly combat casualties to the press corps and the folks back home. These words would have pleased Humpty Dumpty sitting on his wall in the world inside Alice's looking-glass. "When I use a word," he'd said, "it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less." Victory had been used to describe the 111th's near disaster at An Khe. Now it was being used again to describe Ia Drang. Despite the incredible NVA losses, official US totals, unconfirmed by eyewitnesses, were well over 1,000 enemy KIAs. Nowhere did the Americans come close to beating the oft-stated equation Ho Chi Minh had taunted the French with during the Indochina War. You will kill 10 of our men, and we will kill 1 of yours, and in the end it will be you who tire of it. Ia Drang put another word, ambush, into the Humpty Dumpty dictionary too. The destruction of McDade's battalion didn't fit very well with the otherwise victorious fight, so despite all evidence to the contrary, platoon leaders were telling me how the hidden enemy had been everywhere, even dug into the tops of the 6-foot-tall anthills a few feet off the ambushed trail. The 1st Air Cav's Assistant Division Commander, Brigadier General Richard Knowles, told reporters that McDade's battalion had not been ambushed and that they'd probably surprised the NVA unit that subsequently destroyed them. In terms of scale, in terms of the nature and number of the enemy, and in the way the NVA initially stood and fought instead of running away, the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley was unprecedented in America's involvement in Vietnam. Also, Ia Drang and, in fact, the entire Central Highlands Plime campaign, which had begun 5 weeks earlier and of which Ia Drang was a part, heralded a major change in the face of modern warfare. The first real test of America's airmobile might prove in combat the wide-ranging capabilities and worth of the helicopter for the movement of troops and artillery, the evacuation of casualties through medevac choppers and resupply. The fact that the aircav covered enormous distances throughout the battle in comparatively insignificant amounts of time certainly changed the complexion of warfare as any of us knew it, but especially for the North Vietnamese, whose previous enemy, the French, had, as a rule, hacked their way 1 foot after the other through the highlands at a maximum speed of 500 meters per hour. Facing our awesome firepower and sustaining such diabolical casualties among its ranks, a significant part of the high-level American ecstasy after Ia Drang was its proof of the suitability of a war of attrition, the style of war General Westmoreland was waging in Vietnam. But while Westmoreland opined that the reason the NVA stood was to protect a new supply and staging base in the mountains above Ia Drang, it was John Paul Vann, who by now had quit the army as a lieutenant colonel and had returned to Vietnam as an Agency for International Development Aid civilian advisor and recognized expert on the situation there, who correctly suggested that the NVA's purpose at Ia Drang, and hang the expense in lives, was to figure out how to beat the Americans' incredible firepower and amazing mobility. And they accomplished their mission. Sure, they were knocked on their asses and took a long time to recover, and they had to cut back on their fledgling Stage 3 set-piece battles and return to Stage 2 guerrilla hit-and-run operations. But from the fight, they also learned to hug the belt of their enemy, to come in as close as they could in order to neutralize the killing power of our artillery and air support. At Ia Drang, the North Vietnamese learned how to fight us, and looked at in this way, even if the battle was an unprecedented victory for the Americans in our war of attrition, it was an equally unprecedented victory for our enemy in their protracted guerrilla war. The brigade was conducting local security missions around our Pan Rang base camp by the time I returned to my battalion. The above-the-rest training program we'd established, which incorporated lessons learned so far, was also in full swing. But other than that, nothing was happening, and life at our base camp home would have been boring beyond words if all the free time hadn't given me the opportunity to get to know the young officers and find out what they were made of. Cards being just about the only nightlife Phan Rang had to offer, this getting to know you generally took place around a poker table. I cleaned out most of the guys on a regular basis, but as a testament to their mettle, they always came back for more. Lieutenant George Perry from Abu Company, for example, was one of the worst card players I'd ever met. It finally reached the point where I'd tell him to stay home and get a good night's sleep, that I'd be happy to credit his losses against his track record and bill him in the morning. Whatever I said, though, Perry was always at the table that night. Sparkling entertainment at the officer card parties was provided by Battalion Assistant S3 John Dalton Howard, a.k.a. Gentleman John, a West Point lieutenant who'd struck me as being outstanding the first minute I laid eyes on him. He was also a great practical joker and one of the funniest guys I'd ever met. He viewed playing poker with me somewhat as Hank Lunder did, that dumb, I'm not my foreign assistant S3 now making his mark as the top company commander in Emerson's stable of O2 studs. When asked to participate, Johnny came to every game, but when asked to play, he'd usually sit back with a beer in hand and say, "No, my job here is to enhance the conversation." And enhance it he did, with jokes and complete recitals of Rudyard Kipling and other military poems. When he wasn't playing, Gentleman John was a tiger. The main reason he was up at battalion was that I'd pulled him out of his platoon in Abu Company when he started doing Harry the Horse stunts. I knew in my gut if I didn't, he'd get wasted. Also at the poker table in Phan Rang, though I hated to admit it, I finally met my match. Captain Benjamin L. Willis, a volunteer replacement from M8EV. He was the best poker player I'd met since Del Evans in Korea. My long-time belief that great warriors were, or should be, great poker players was certainly borne out by Ben. His incredible common sense and street fighter's cunning belied his West Point education. Even he said most academy graduates were too smart to be infantrymen, and he freely admitted he'd graduated at the bottom of his class. I had enormous respect for Willis's judgment and ability. In my view, he was probably one of the best American guerrilla fighters in the Republic of Vietnam. If I personally taught him anything in the 3 tours we would ultimately serve together, in the early days of our friendship he taught me even more. From time to time, on nights when poker got old and a fair amount of boozing had gone down, we'd conduct a raid on downtown Pan Rang, specifically on Madame Nu's House of Pleasure. It hadn't taken long to find out who shared my view of combat soldiers and sex, those of rampant libido, as Johnny Howard succinctly observed. On the nights themselves, I'd send word down to the company CPs that Major Hackworth requests your presence at Madame Nu's. When all interested officers were assembled, normally a wild, drunken mob, we'd pile into jeeps and head into town. Usually the subsequent events were pretty straightforward, although one notable exception was the night everyone wanted a second round and no one had enough money to pay for it. The Vietnamese madam happily accepted a transistor radio as compensation for her girls' double rations. The radio belonged to one of the lieutenants, though God only knew why he'd brought it along. From that point we had it made in the shade until the MPs started banging on the whorehouse door, presumably because of all the airborne jeeps outside. My guys were all on the second floor. As the situation heated up, we scrambled to make our getaway. I found myself scaling down the side of the building with another battalion officer, employing tactics neither of us had used since our rapping training days back at Fort Campbell. Fortunately, the whole group got out intact, and we soon roared off into the night, beyond the clutches of the law. We were like a college varsity football team, and I was the coach and captain. I didn't think twice about drinking and gambling and letting off steam with the men off hours. I always thought the Army's rule against fraternizing with subordinates was wrong anyway. If you can tell them to die, you should be able to get blasted with them, as long as they knew that come morning it was all duty and they got no break from partying with the boss. Of course, they got no break from not partying with the boss either. When a contingent of the young officers went to the opening of the base camp's Brigade Officers Club, didn't invite me along, and got themselves into a huge drunken fight, I was the one who got my arse chewed by Colonel Rogers, who correctly believed I was responsible for infusing the fighters with such wild spirit. I wouldn't have minded this if I had been invited, but as it was, the following morning I assembled all the transgressors. "You're a bunch of bums," I said. "That was a brand new club you destroyed. Are you crazy? I'm telling you now, and I'm only going to say it once. This drinking to excess has got to stop. Do you understand?" Judging from their collective hungover moans as they shuffled slowly out of the room, my young friends got the message. That evening, I paid my own visit to the Brigade Officers Club. Hancock came along with me, and we seriously tied one on. When we came staggering home, we decided we ought to drop by the battalion's TOC and give the duty officer, who that night happened to be Gentleman John Howard, a hard time. As luck would have it, all was quiet, and Johnny was asleep when we arrived. We woke him up by grabbing his hands and feet, and before he could even protest, we'd carried him out of the TOC, tied him to the hood of my jeep, and proceeded to drive him all around the base camp. Johnny had been one of the guys who'd withstood my morning tirade on the abuse of alcohol. When we finally untied him from the jeep, he just looked at me deadpan and said, "So much for a new perspective on moderation, sir." To be able to slip between the roles of buddy and boss was a skill I'd learned from Steve Preener and the other trusted NCOs. The officers accepted the ground rules. As Tiger Lieutenant Dennis Foley later explained it, I had an ability to violate one rule of leadership. Over-familiarity breeds contempt. You could be overly familiar with Hack, he said, but it was always on his terms. When he pulled the reins back, it was as if you never even knew he had a first name. We could go out with him and raise all kinds of hell until dawn, but the next day, God forbid we mentioned that we went or failed to perform adequately, or looked as if we were hungover or needed some sleep. We soldiered, and it was not discussed. It was with this understanding that a foundation of love and respect was established all around, which would add mightily to the battalion's strength not long down the track. I liked Dennis Foley from the minute I met him. He was a tall, skinny, bespectacled kid, an army brat who'd gone to OCS after a couple of years of enlisted service. When I gave him command of one of the Tiger platoons, I also gave him my Sergeant Sweeney. Foley was as ashen-faced as most lieutenants were when confronted with the fact that they didn't know anything about leading troops. But according to Phil Belden, the old pro-NCO who actually ran the unit while Foley learned, the new lieutenant was shaping up fine. One thing Foley was a bit slower off the mark with, though, was the art of scrounging. That became painfully clear to me the day I received the humiliating news that he and his boss, Tiger Co. Jim Gardner, had been caught in the act. Apparently, the two had decided they were going to scrounge a refrigerator for the HQ company mess, a fine and generous idea from the USAF base just down the road in Phan Rang. Their fatal error had been to trust the Air Force lieutenant they met at the USAF Officers Club, who, in a moment of drunken camaraderie, told them the easiest way to get a refrigerator was to use his name at the base's supply dump. The flyboy was correct, but just as Gardner and Foley finished loading up the refrigerator, no questions asked, and started driving away, back at the bar, the supply lieutenant got scared and reported everything to the air police. Within minutes, my Tigers, who were probably drunker than the Air Force lieutenant, were ambushed by the base security guards. When confronted with the fact that they had a stolen refrigerator in the back of their truck, they confidently maintained that it must have fallen in. The first I heard of the matter was the late-night call I got from an irate USAF colonel. When he finished chewing my arse, which took a fair while, I told him I'd take care of it. Two very drunk Tiger lieutenants sobered up quickly when told by the colonel to report to me ASAP. "Can't we just go to Linworth?" young Foley reportedly asked. I was mad as hell, but the two lieutenants needn't have worried. I didn't want a pound of flesh. I just couldn't believe that these two guys, these two Tigers, had screwed up so badly. It wouldn't have happened in the Raiders. "Just don't let it happen again," I roared as the two men stood miserably at attention before me. "If you can't do it without getting caught, then don't do it at all." General Westmoreland visited the brigade at Thanksgiving, hands on hips, his square jaw jutting out. He stood on a box and inspired the troops with cheers that we were beating the VC into near submission. Before he left, the brigade was issued, per man, 2 little cards to carry around in the jungle and study like the Bible. One was MACV's 9-rule card, which spelled out MACV policy for winning the hearts and minds of the people, and the other, the Standing Orders of Rogers Rangers, written in 1759. The latter item was a decided plus. Even Maxwell D. Taylor had said the VC was an enemy as shrewd, well-tried, and with the guile of the American Indian during his best days, and Major Robert Rogers 200, year-old guidelines were as applicable in Vietnam as they had been in the American colonies during the French and Indian and Revolutionary Wars. Unfortunately, the card creators at MACV and Saigon soon went into the same overdrive as the research and development people in Washington. Before the Vietnam War was over, American combat soldiers would virtually need a truck to carry all their prompt cards: a troop leading card, a code of conduct card, a patrol leader's card, a mines and booby trap card, a 5-paragraph field order card, a card for every occasion card. You name it, the troops had it. The holiday was rounded out with a traditional Thanksgiving feast complete with all the trimmings. It tasted great, despite what old paratrooper First Sergeant Leo B. Smith told me, that at least one of the turkeys was 25 years old, a surplus bird frozen since the Second World War. Still, I couldn't help but marvel at how screwed up MACV's priorities continued to be. After 4 months in Vietnam and a home-style, nothing is too good for the troops Thanksgiving dinner, we were still short on the essentials: jungle boots, jungle fatigues, gun patches, oil and cleaning rods. After 4 months in Vietnam, no one had recognized that the 1st Battalion, 11th Infantry, was not being used in a normal airborne role, and we were still ridiculously ill-equipped in terms of vehicles, weapons, and equipment to function as a regular infantry unit. We'd become so disillusioned that, as delicious as that turkey dinner was, there was no question that the troopers would have been a lot more thankful on Thanksgiving 1965 if MACV had given us chicken sandwiches instead, and spent their time, energy, and money addressing our critical operational shortages. Thanksgiving had barely passed when the 5th ARVN Regiment was decimated in a battle with Main Force VC units at the Michelin rubber plantation near Ben Cat, just 45 kilometres northwest of Saigon. The VC had controlled the rich rubber country around Ben Cat and nearby Loc Ninh for 20 years. This area had been the birthplace of the Viet Minh's insurgent effort against the French. Despite numerous bloody battles fought by our predecessors, it was always the guerrillas who prevailed. Curiously, the French-owned Michelin plantation had operated continuously in this VC stronghold since the fall of Dien Bien Phu, its only acknowledgement of the ongoing war being signs demanding that combatants not damage the trees. In October 1965, however, the plantation's operations came to an end, and so did this typical French complacency. The VC infiltrated the plantation, demanded taxes from the owners, and made a lasting impression on all the workers by executing their South Vietnamese foreman right in front of them. Michelin closed down, and the 7th ARVN was sent in to guard the real estate. Their mission turned into a disaster, only compounded when American aircraft accidentally dropped bombs right in the middle of a 350-man relief unit of ARVN Rangers. General Westmoreland ordered a massive retaliatory operation to secure the plantation and get the VC. His choice of Allied units for the job included elements of the US 1st Division, the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, and a 2-battalion task force from the 101st Airborne. This choice was unstated testimony that he and his staff had concluded that the ARVN didn't have a hope in hell of winning this war, and it would soon become, if it wasn't already, an all-American show. The initial role of Tim's travelling trouble in this operation was to take over the defence of Bien Hoa airfield. The Aussies were under the operational control, OPCON, of the 173rd as its 3rd manoeuvre element. While those 2 units conducted operations, it wasn't bad duty. The troopers were rested and aching for a fight. With the exception of Saigon, Bien Hoa, halfway between Saigon and Ben Cat, was as close to the land of the Big PX as one could probably get in South Vietnam in 1965. Lavish air-conditioned clubs with floor shows, open-air barbecues, slot machines, long slick bars with drinks no more than 2 bits a shot, top-quality food, and even Broadway entertainment, most recently Hello, Dolly, starring Mary Martin. Pinch me, I thought when we first arrived. For a minute there, I thought I was supposed to be in a war zone. The last time I'd been to Bien Hoa was in June during the advanced party days. While the other members of our party were farmed out to the individual units already deployed to observe, learn, and be prepared to pass this knowledge on to their own units when they arrived, I'd taken the opportunity to visit almost all the US outfits in the field to get an overall view of what was happening. The walkabout had proved invaluable, if only to find that there was little point in placing any of our party with the US Marines who were operating in the north up in I Corps or with the 173rd at Bien Hoa, because they would only learn bad habits. It wasn't that the Marines or the 173rd were short on good soldiers or strong leaders, but they were sloppy on the basics of staying alive in an armed environment, and their gung-ho assault on the beachhead or drop zone tactics could not have been more wrong for a guerrilla war. I quickly discovered that besides the US Special Forces A-teams who ran and manned the Civilian Irregular Defence Group, CIDG, frontier border camps, it was the Australians under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Brumfield who seemed to be the most knowledgeable in terms of how to fight a guerrilla in a jungle environment. So I began encouraging the infantry members of the advanced party to mosey on over and have a look. The Australians' expertise was not exactly surprising. It was based on experience gained not just in their Australia-based training program, which concentrated solely on jungle warfare at a 10,000-acre tropical rainforest training ground, but also on the jungle battlegrounds of New Guinea and Borneo during World War II, as well as during the post-war Malayan conflict, a war of insurgency the Aussies shared with the Brits for a dozen years. Historically, the Australians were a well-respected force, a fact expressed best by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel a quarter of a century before when he said, "During the fighting in Africa, those damn Australians." A single admonition found in a captured VC diary proved the Aussies had already made a similar impression in the present conflict. "When you're engaging the Australians," it warned, "watch your flanks with special care." Major John Essex Clarke was the S3. He was a giant of a man and a stud of a soldier, one of the last battlefield commissions in the British Army. He'd spent 13 years fighting guerrillas in Rhodesia and the Belgian Congo, and 2 years on long-range patrols on special operations in Malaya. We'd met during the advanced party days, and even in that short time, he taught me plenty about guerrilla fighting. Now that the 1st Brigade was at Bien Hoa, we had a chance to become reacquainted, and not a few beers were downed at the Bien Hoa USAF Officers Club as we picked up where we'd left off. Clarke was no more impressed these days than when we first met by the large unit company and battalion-sized tactics of his gung-ho American counterparts in the 173rd. The Aussies used squads to make contact and brought in reinforcing elements to do the killing. They planned in the belief that a platoon on the battlefield could do anything, including getting out. While the 1st Brigade was starting to develop small unit tactics with the Tigers and Hank Emerson's rondos, the biggest stumbling block to the widespread adoption of such tactics among the Americans was the senior commander's unwillingness to break down their organizations into such seemingly devouring chunks. In any event, I still maintained that the Australians understood the war better than our guys ever would. So, at Bien Hoa, I pitched Essex Clarke a cross-training proposal I'd been thinking about since we first met, sending above-the-rest platoon leaders over to the pros at R to gain jungle fighting knowledge that they could bring back and infuse throughout their units. Essex Clarke agreed to the idea, and we decided on a post-Christmas start for the programme to give me time to clear it with Colonel Timothy. When the brigade was relieved of its airfield security mission, we moved overland along Route 13 to Li Ke in the Michelin plantation. It was an expensive journey. Before our first day was out, the 327th had taken 3 KIAs and 10 WIAs, when VC Command detonated mines destroyed 2 of our jeeps and a troop carrying 2 1-2-ton truck. The 1st Brigade's operation, Checkerboard, commenced on December 12th with a massive airmobile assault. After months of scratching around for whatever lift we could get, we and the 101st could not believe the number of helicopter assets assembled for the task. The first lift alone was composed of 40 UH-1D troop-carrying choppers, also known as Hughes or Slicks, able to carry 2 complete rifle companies into the battle area simultaneously. Airmobile assaults were both exciting and frightening. Each one was a gut-churning event, not dissimilar to the moment before you jump out of an airplane with a parachute on your back. The chill down your spine and the tightening in your stomach started the moment you loaded into the chopper. You sat down on your steel pot, trusting the Huey's thin underbelly to keep you in possession of your most vital organs, and soon you were bolting skyward as if ascending in a high-speed elevator. The Slicks moved in a line like giant locusts approaching the LZ. They swung into a big orbit, staying out of the way of the TAC air preparing the ground below. You could see the napalm and cluster bomblets crunching down and the big geysers created by heavier bombs. Then the TAC air aircraft pulled away with a flourish, and artillery rained down. The Slicks were joined mid-air by gunships, which, when the artillery was lifted, hosed down the tree lines with machine guns, rockets, and fast-firing M79 grenades. The Slicks landed and discharged their troops only when they'd landed did the Slicks' door gunners open up, while troops hit the ground running with hearts in their mouths, bent double to avoid the whirling thump-thump-thump of the chopper blades. Through the noise and confusion, they had to secure the tree line for subsequent lifts to go in without covering fire. It was a concerto of awesome firepower coordinated with split-second timing, an intricate ballet of man and machine. Everybody had to have each other's backs: troopers, crews, artillery, and Air Force supporters, because on top of everything else, it all happened at more than 100 miles an hour. I was on the ground with the troops during checkerboard, sent with no need for a second invitation by Colonel Rogers to see how the companies were doing. Since the fan-rang game of company command musical chairs, no major contacts with the VC occurred during the operation. While the Lika Ben Cat area proved to be a major logistic base for the Viet Cong, complete with a hospital complex, training facilities, and large unit base camps and mess halls, judging from the lack of booby traps among these installations and the freshly prepared, still warm food we found in cooking pots, the VC units who lived there had decided to run away rather than take us on. Still, they'd left calling cards throughout the rubber plantation and double canopy jungle, making the battlefield particularly grim. Like Queen Yon, wherever a trooper walked, there seemed to be a mine or an explosive booby trap. We had a number of casualties and countless near misses. Other primitive but highly effective devices we encountered included tiger traps with razor-sharp bamboo spears at the bottom, but much worse were the huge logs the enemy had rigged up and hidden in trees. The unlucky infantryman who sprang the concealed tripwire of one of these devices would find 200 pounds of teak, usually studded with spikes, catapulting down on him at 50 miles per hour. The jungle held other routine unpleasantries like red ants and leeches, but even more dangerous to the soldiers was their own behaviour within the bush. One example was the several friendly casualties that occurred when a grenade was tossed, hit the trees, and bounced back on the troops. It was a common accident. The men still had not come to terms with jungle fighting. The Screaming Eagle's long orientation for desert warfare was one of our worst enemies. The overall lack of training for this terrain had troopers sounding and acting like a herd of elephants crashing through the forest. Nowhere was this more evident to me than when Operation Checkerboard drew to a close, and I accompanied Lieutenant Pat Graves's B Company platoon on the way out of the jungle. It was an experience that made me respect the enormous difficulties the ground-pounders in Vietnam faced. Machetes were wielded against the dense, uncompromising bush that rose into double and triple canopies, making the day seem like night. Point men changed repeatedly as the exhausting job of hacking through the jungle overtook them. Then, suddenly, the dark, dank, impenetrable jungle opened up, but it did not reveal daylight. Instead, we found ourselves just 5 feet in front of another unit. Fortunately, they were 502 guys doing the exact same thing we were. Due to Graves's unerring navigation, we had hacked our way right into our link-up point with the 502, but what was most amazing was that neither group had heard or seen the other until that moment. Both were so busily and loudly hacking away that it was just good luck that neither was VC. While Operation Checkerboard proved successful in terms of disrupting the enemy's logistics system, blowing up VC tunnels, burning down half-built VC villages, and uncovering and destroying enormous quantities of rice, ammunition, and VC black pajamas, the major purpose of the 5-day mission was not met. We failed to find the enemy in large formations or numbers, much less destroy him. The VC had to go somewhere, no doubt to sanctuaries in Cambodia, or within the densely forested War Zone D adjacent to the Cambodian border, or War Zone C, which led virtually to the gates of Saigon, perhaps even under our very feet in his vast tunnel complexes. Early in the war, the failure of Operation Checkerboard to find the enemy illustrated the limitations of American large-scale, incredibly expensive multi-battalion operations. They were simply no match for a cunning foe who lived by Mao's conviction. Give me a path wide enough to move a mule, and I will move an army. Christmas came and went, and on December 27th, Lieutenants Harry the Horse Godwin, Pat Graves, and John Dorland, another fine West Point stud, went over to R in Bien Hoa as John Clark and I had agreed. The 3 lieutenants commanded a platoon in each of the rifle companies. The plan was that they'd stay with the Aussies for a month, bring back to their companies the lessons learned, and if the program proved worthwhile, they would be followed by 3 more of our lieutenants. I hadn't exactly cleared this cross-training idea with Colonel Timothy. When I brought the subject up, he said he'd have to check with the people in Saigon, and within days word came back that the concept was a no-go. The reason given was that sending American troops, particularly troops from the 101st, America's finest, to the Aussies would be like admitting we didn't know what the hell we were doing. Since I thought the issue was more critical than MHCV's potentially bruised pride, I assessed the likelihood of being found out if I ignored the guidance and sent the lieutenants anyway. When I concluded the odds weighed heavily in my favour, I went ahead. It was selective insubordination that I truly believed would benefit the whole battalion. Although the 1st Brigade, 101st Airborne Division, would continue to play fire brigade for the rest of its first year in Vietnam, the days of Tim's travelling trouble were coming to an end. In early January, Colonel Timothy led the 327th and the 502nd on his last operation with the brigade, before moving on to Pleiku to become the 2nd Corps senior advisor. The operation took the two battalions to the city of Toi Hoa, 100 miles to the north, and its rice paddies by the sea. In years past, 80% of the rice harvest there had been gobbled up by the Viet Cong. The brigade's mission was as it had been at Kin Hon, to protect the farmers and their crop even as they found Charlie and kicked his ass. The 327th was left behind to secure the brigade's base camp and conduct operations in VC-controlled villages southwest of Phan Rang. For us at Phan Rang, the month of January was pretty uneventful. The high point was when a Tiger Force medic, who also happened to be an American Indian, somehow missed an airmobile assault and, in the fine tradition of his forefathers, travelled overland alone through VC territory until he tracked down his unit in the middle of the jungle. Though the supply situation was improving all the time by Christmas, we had been set up with most essentials through regular supply channels, the above the rest had well augmented its share through its enthusiastic scamming effort, which was ongoing in the first month of 1966. But how far Hancock and friends had gone to upgrade our standard of living, I don't think even I comprehended until Colonel Timothy's successor, Brigadier General Willard Pearson, whom few of us knew anything about, except that he'd most recently been an assistant division commander in the 101st at Campbell, joined me in a chopper to have an orientation look at the base camp from the air a week or so before he took over the brigade. We flew over the area, and below us saw a few dozen tents. Then we flew over the O2 strike force, which also had a few dozen tents. When we got over my battalion, which, thanks to Hancock and his merry men, had a GP tent for virtually every 11-man squad, from the air it looked as if we had 1,000,000 tents. "Where'd you get all those tents?" General Pearson asked. It was a logical question. "We scrounged them, sir," I replied, praying that this unknown quantity of a commander-to-be was not going to be a strict bookman. General Pearson didn't say another word. My guess, as I looked down at my unit area with a mixture of heartfelt pride and great relief, was that the new commander didn't want to know, and it was true, he didn't. Pearson had no time for the small stuff. He had already moved on, pondering how his new command might get the VC even better.